In the heart of America's capital, a seemingly routine visit was about to unfold, yet it would ultimately expose the true meaning of strength through an arrogant command. A veteran, unwavering in his duty, was about to change how everyone present perceived respect. It was a quintessential autumn afternoon in Washington, D.C., with sunlight filtering through the vibrant leaves, casting dappled patterns across the expansive plaza in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Tourists milled about, their chatter creating a low hum, while the air held a distinct sense of reverence. This was a place where history breathed, a quiet monument to enduring American ideals. But that tranquility was about to be interrupted. A sleek convoy of black SUVs, the kind that whispered power rather than roared it, glided into the plaza, their tinted windows reflecting the historic surroundings. The arrival immediately drew curious glances, hinting at the presence of someone significant, someone accustomed to commanding attention. What's your favorite American landmark that symbolizes respect? Drop a comment below and tell us, we genuinely read every one. The lead SUV's door swung open, and out stepped Donald Trump, a figure instantly recognizable to virtually everyone. At 78, he still carried himself with a familiar, almost theatrical, swagger. His perfectly tailored navy blue overcoat, impeccably pressed, and that signature red tie, a flash of bold color against the muted tones of the memorial, were quintessential elements of his public persona. He adjusted his collar, scanning the solemn expanse of the plaza with the air of a man appraising a valuable piece of real estate, perhaps mentally calculating how much it would be worth if only it could be developed. Still doing the whole antique statue thing, huh? He muttered, loud enough for his nearby aides and Secret Service detail to hear. You'd think with all this history, they'd at least update the decor, maybe bring in some actual modern security instead of these guys standing around like painted dolls. His entourage exchanged strained glances, a familiar, uncomfortable tension settling in the air. Across the expansive, meticulously paved plaza, stood Thomas Morrison, a 68-year-old retired Marine Corps veteran. He wasn't there for a ceremony, but as a dedicated veteran honor guardian, a role he took with profound solemnity. Dressed in a simple, well-maintained uniform, not a parade dress, but his working day attire, he stood sentinel by the Lincoln Memorial, a silent guardian of its hallowed ground. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on a distant point, embodying a stillness that seemed to defy the bustling activity around him. Morrison had served with distinction in the Vietnam War, enduring the brutal realities of urban combat. He'd earned a Silver Star and a Purple Heart for his unwavering courage during a desperate evacuation, holding his position under intense fire until every last comrade and casualty was safely out. His name, though not known to the masses, was a testament to resilience and profound sacrifice. He was a living monument to duty. With that characteristic swagger that suggested boundaries were merely suggestions, Donald Trump veered off the designated visitor pathway, striding directly towards Morrison. His Secret Service detail instinctively tightened around him, a ripple of unease passing through the crowd. Phones, already lifted for candid shots of the memorial, now focused on the approaching figure, a collective anticipation building. Trump stopped just a few feet from the motionless veteran, close enough to make it personal, yet far enough to maintain a semblance of plausible deniability. He folded his arms, adopting an air of casual inspection, as if examining a display, not a man. Now, that, he boomed, projecting his voice for the benefit of the rapidly growing audience, is some outfit. Tremendous, very theatrical. Who's the designer? Is it someone from one of those big Hollywood war movies? A few of his entourage managed forced, uncomfortable chuckles, the kind that spoke of obligation rather than amusement. Morrison didn't blink. Not even a flicker. Trump smirked, taking another half-step forward, infringing on the unspoken personal space that most tourists instinctively respected. You know, in the States, soldiers salute their commanders. I've been saluted by generals, Marines, Navy guys, you name it. Even got a salute from a French colonel once. And trust me, that's not easy to get. He actually mimicked a stiff military posture, raising his hand in an exaggerated, mock salute that would have been funny if it weren't so deeply inappropriate in such a solemn setting. You salute your president, don't you? Trump continued, cocking his head with that familiar expression of someone who believed he was being incredibly clever. "Well, I'm a president. Still am to a lot of people. So, go ahead. Show the people some respect. That's an order." The crowd froze. You could feel it, that tangible shift from casual curiosity to something much more uncomfortable. Phones remained aloft, but the expressions behind them had shifted from amusement to genuine concern. Morrison's face revealed absolutely nothing. No defiance, no confusion, no irritation. It was like looking at a perfectly composed mask of professional discipline. If he had registered Trump's presence at all, there was no external sign of it. A few tourists slowly lowered their phones, their faces showing the dawning realization that they might be witnessing something they'd rather not. Trump's aide stepped closer, murmuring, "Sir, he's not supposed to, show." Trump waved him off without breaking eye contact with the motionless veteran. "He heard me." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but not quite whispering. "Come on, just a little salute. You want to make an ally feel respected, don't you?" Near the rope barrier, a small girl, no older than 9, tugged on her mom's coat with that insistent urgency only children can manage. "Mom, is that man allowed to talk to the soldier like that?" Her mother didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice carried that careful tone parents use when trying to explain something complicated to a child. "No, sweetheart. But some people think rules don't apply to them." Morrison remained perfectly still, his rifle held at precisely the correct angle, eyes locked on that distant point that honor guardians are trained to focus on. It wasn't that he was ignoring Trump. It was that maintaining his post, upholding the solemnity of the memorial, required a level of focus that transcended whatever commotion was happening in his immediate vicinity. His stillness was not inaction, it was an act of profound discipline. Trump turned slightly toward the crowd, arms raised in that characteristic, "Can you believe this?" gesture that had become his trademark. "What?" "Nothing." "Is he frozen? Is this guy on strike or something?" An American tourist, perhaps trying to be helpful, called out, "He's not going to move, sir." That's kind of the whole point. Trump glanced back at Morrison, and for the first time, you could see genuine irritation starting to creep around the edges of his practiced showmanship. The smirk wavered just slightly. "You think you're better than me? You think this uniform makes you untouchable?" His voice dropped to something closer to a growl. "I said, salute me. Now." Nothing. Not a blink, not the slightest shift in posture. And suddenly, what had started as a performance had become something else entirely. The crowd had shifted, gone from amused onlookers to increasingly uncomfortable witnesses. Some people were turning their phones off completely. The laughter had completely died. Morrison hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't said a word, hadn't even acknowledged that anything unusual was happening. And yet somehow, in that perfect stillness, he had just reminded everyone present, without uttering a single syllable, exactly where the boundaries were and exactly what happens when someone who's used to getting their way meets someone who simply won't. The tension in that plaza was so thick you could practically slice it with a ceremonial sword. Trump was still standing there, maybe 3 feet from Thomas Morrison, clearly expecting some kind of reaction, any reaction. But he was getting nothing. Absolutely nothing. "This guy's something else," Trump muttered, shaking his head with that exaggerated grin that didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. "I've had Marines salute me on 5 continents. Got a standing ovation from the Israeli Knesset. This guy can't even blink." He started circling slowly, hands clasped behind his back like he was a drill instructor inspecting a particularly stubborn recruit. "How do you people keep a straight face doing this all day? Don't you get tired of pretending you're statues?" Morrison maintained that perfect forward gaze, unmoved as granite. From somewhere in the crowd, you heard this quiet voice, an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 60s, wearing a faded olive-green jacket with a small American flag pin on the lapel. He spoke just loud enough for the people around him to hear, but there was something in his tone that made others lean in to listen. "That one was in Phnom," he said, nodding subtly toward the motionless veteran. "Held a position under heavy fire, made sure his men got out. He's not pretending." A young boy, maybe 10 or 11, tugged on the man's sleeve. "Who's that orange man yelling at the soldier?" The veteran looked down at the kid, then back at the scene unfolding in front of them. A loud voice trying to get attention from someone who earned his the hard way. You could see it rippling through the crowd now, that shift when people started to really understand what they were watching. The phones were still up, but nobody was smiling through their screens anymore. The atmosphere had changed from curious entertainment to something much more serious, much more uncomfortable. Trump's aide checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes, his eyes constantly scanning the growing crowd of onlookers. They weren't laughing anymore, and you could practically see him calculating how badly this could go viral. "You're not saluting because of politics, are you?" Trump continued, his voice now carrying a sharper edge. "Because I wasn't your guy." Still nothing from Morrison. "Or is it ego? You think you're better than me standing there like that?" The silence stretched and stretched until it became its own kind of answer. An American woman near the back of the crowd shook her head slowly, speaking to no one in particular, but loud enough for several people to hear. "He doesn't think he's better. He just knows he's not lesser." Someone else murmured, "This is painful to watch." And it was, because what had started as Trump trying to assert dominance had become something else entirely. He was clearly growing more agitated, his voice losing that performative bravado and taking on the crack of real irritation. "You're a soldier, aren't you?" he demanded, stepping even closer to the line he shouldn't cross. "You follow orders. I just gave you one." The silence that followed wasn't passive anymore. It wasn't empty. It was active resistance in its purest, quietest form. The kind that didn't need fists or shouting or grand gestures. It just needed presence, composure, the absolute refusal to be moved by bluster. A teenage girl whispered to her friend. "Why doesn't he just leave?" "Because he's losing," came the answer. "And he knows it." For the first time in the entire exchange, Trump hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, and what he saw there probably wasn't what he was expecting. Their expressions had turned stone serious. Some looked embarrassed for him. Some looked angry at him. None looked amused anymore. He tried to recover, throwing up his arms in that exaggerated gesture of exasperation. "Well, I guess he's above even a presidential order. Maybe we'll see if the current president gets more respect," but the joke fell completely flat. No one laughed. No one even smiled because they all understood something Trump apparently didn't. Thomas Morrison wasn't being disrespectful. He was being disciplined. He was following a code of honor that had existed for centuries, a code that didn't bend for anyone, regardless of their title, their ego, or their expectation of deference. And the power of that discipline, of standing absolutely still when every camera, every insult, and every provocation was trying to pull you off course, was slowly filling the entire plaza like flood water. Trump was still talking, still gesturing, still trying to command the moment. But no one was really listening anymore. They were watching Morrison. The man who hadn't moved, the man who wouldn't be moved. And for maybe the first time in his entire public life, the man who always demanded attention didn't have it. The sound that cut through the tension was unmistakable, the crisp, measured rhythm of polished leather shoes against flagstone. Everyone turned to see a tall woman in an impeccably pressed navy blue pantsuit emerging from the path leading from the World War II memorial, moving with that particular kind of measured urgency that suggested someone in authority had decided things had gone quite far enough. Major General Mary Carter, Special Envoy for Veteran Affairs. If you've ever wondered what quiet authority looks like, she was basically the textbook definition, tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of bearing that came from decades of navigating complex political and military landscapes. She had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, rising through the ranks with an undeniable presence. She approached Trump with the practiced ease of someone who dealt with difficult dignitaries before, offering a polite but unmistakably firm nod. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice carrying that distinct quality of being perfectly courteous while simultaneously brooking absolutely no argument. "I'm General Carter. On behalf of the Department of Veteran Affairs, I must ask that you return to the designated viewing path." Trump flashed one of his trademark grins and pointed toward Morrison without actually looking at him. "Just admiring the setup here, General. Great costumes, amazing posture. You should see how quickly my Secret Service guys salute when I walk past." General Carter didn't even blink. "Sir, our veteran honor guardians are not actors. They are serving members of our armed forces, and those who have honorably separated. This area is a federal memorial site, and your proximity violates standing federal protocol." Standing federal protocol? Trump's eyebrows went up like he was genuinely amused by the concept. "I've been saluted by kings and generals, General. Don't tell me I can't talk to a man in a worn-out uniform." She met his gaze directly, steady and clear as glass. "And yet, none of them needed to be told twice, sir." Boom. Just like that. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, just a simple statement that landed like a precision-guided missile. The crowd around them went dead quiet. You could actually hear someone's sharp intake of breath. A barely audible poof rippled through the onlookers. Trump tried to laugh it off, gesturing broadly toward the memorial with both arms. "You know, I've always liked this place. Tremendous architecture. I even had tea with the Queen once. Tremendous lady. I told her this would be a great place for a golf course if you flattened the back garden and put in 18 holes." General Carter's expression didn't shift by even a millimeter. "This isn't a golf course, Mr. Trump." That got an actual chuckle from the crowd, not with him, but decidedly at him. And you could see it register on his face, that moment when someone who's used to controlling the room realizes the room has turned. He pivoted back toward Morrison, clearly still rankled by the veteran's continued silence. "All I said was, salute me. You'd think I insulted the crown jewels or something. You instructed a United States veteran to break his solemn duty on federal ground," General Carter said, her tone never shifting from that perfectly professional register, but with each word carrying the weight of steel wrapped in silk. "In our tradition, service is to the nation, not to personalities." Trump's mouth opened, then closed. His aide stepped closer, whispering something urgent near his shoulder. He waved the man off with visible irritation. All right, Trump muttered, taking half a step back, the first retreat he'd made all afternoon. "Didn't realize you all were so sensitive about your mannequins." General Carter didn't respond to the insult. Her silence wasn't wounded pride. It was protocol. Professional discipline that didn't need to defend itself because it simply was. And behind her, Thomas Morrison still hadn't moved. Still hadn't acknowledged any of this. Still stood like he was carved from the very stones of the memorial itself. The crowd had shifted again. A middle-aged man, probably a teacher judging by his patient demeanor with the group of teenagers around him, leaned down to one of his students. "That veteran just won more respect standing still than most people get shouting on a stage," he murmured. The teenager nodded, eyes still fixed on Morrison. He didn't even say a word. Trump cast one more glance around the plaza, maybe trying to salvage something from this moment, but the stage had completely turned. The tourists weren't looking at him anymore. They weren't hanging on his words or waiting for his next move. They were watching the veteran. The man who didn't flinch. The man who wouldn't be moved. And the officer who didn't need to raise her voice to make her point. Somewhere in the crowd, you heard a whispered, "He held the line." Another voice followed, and never even looked him in the eye. The moment no longer belonged to Trump. He had stepped into a tradition that doesn't bow, doesn't bend, and definitely doesn't salute on demand. And now he was standing in the middle of it, realizing that for all his bluster and expectation and practiced dominance, some things simply won't be moved. You could feel it in the air, that electric tension of a confrontation that had reached its absolute breaking point. Trump was standing there just beyond where General Carter intercepted him, still within clear view of Thomas Morrison. His aides hovered behind him like nervous birds, not saying a word. Even the Secret Service agents had that particular look of professionals who just wanted this moment to be over so they could all go home. But Trump, he wasn't finished. Not yet. He turned back toward the veteran with one final attempt at reclaiming control of this situation. "You know something," he said, projecting his voice for the entire plaza to hear. "I rebuilt our military. Billions of dollars. I did more for our armed forces than your own politicians ever did." There was a ripple through the crowd. Some heads turned. A few tourists instinctively looked to General Carter, but she remained perfectly still, letting the moment play out. Trump stepped closer again, not crossing the line this time, but standing right at the very edge of it, defiant and unyielding. That's real power. That's leadership. So, show me some respect. Salute your former commander-in-chief. Morrison didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't acknowledge the demand any more than he had all the previous ones. And then finally, he moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. It wasn't angry. It was just decisive. Morrison's right hand shifted on his rifle, lifting it just slightly in a formal repositioning, not breaking discipline, not abandoning his post, just a subtle, practiced adjustment that any military observer would recognize as a closing gesture. A soldier's way of saying, "This interaction is finished." And then he spoke. One line, firm, unwavering, delivered without ever breaking that ceremonial forward stare. "This stance, for country alone." The words hit the plaza like a thunderclap in perfect silence. You could literally hear the collective breath leave the crowd. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be loud. It was delivered with the same calm precision that Morrison had maintained throughout this entire ordeal, but it completely shattered every assumption Trump had made about this moment. Trump's mouth opened to respond, but no sound came out. For the first time all afternoon, his expression changed, not into fury, not into offense, but into something else entirely. Something that might almost be recognition. Not admiration, not respect, but the faint, grudging understanding that he had just run headlong into something bigger than himself. Behind the rope barrier, a young boy, maybe 9 or 10, raised his small hand to his forehead in an uncertain little salute. He didn't fully understand what he'd witnessed, but he'd seen something in that veteran that spoke to him, something worth honoring the only way he knew how. Then another child did the same, then their mother, then the old Vietnam veteran who spoke up earlier, then 2 American tourists who had been filming, quietly lowering their phones and straightening their backs. One by one, people along the rope line turned their bodies toward the veteran. Not to gawk, not to film, not to judge, but to acknowledge, to participate in something larger than celebrity and spectacle, to stand still, to offer their own silence back to the man who had wielded his with more power than any podium ever provided. Morrison didn't look at them. His duty wasn't to public opinion or crowd approval. But the tourists no longer needed his attention. They had learned something from his example, and they were following his lead. And Trump, for the first time in perhaps decades, he said nothing. His hands, which had been gesturing and animated throughout this entire encounter, slowly dropped to his sides. He looked around the plaza, scanning the faces of the people watching, not for applause, not for approval, but trying to assess something he clearly hadn't expected. He was no longer the center of this moment. The man he tried to command had, through pure silence and unwavering discipline, taken the entire plaza with him. General Carter took a slow, measured breath and nodded toward Trump's aides. One of them stepped forward and whispered, "Mr. Trump, we should return to the motorcade." This time, he didn't argue. He didn't protest. He didn't demand one more chance to make his point. He simply turned and began walking back toward his waiting vehicles, his entourage falling into step behind him. But here's the thing. As he walked away, the stillness didn't break. No one booed, no one mocked, no one cheered, but no one followed either. He walked alone, surrounded by the most powerful sound in the world, the silence of a man who refused to be moved. The echo of Trump's polished shoes on stone faded gradually as he made his way back across the plaza. Each step sounding somehow smaller than the last, like punctuation marks on a sentence that had already ended. His aides trailed behind him at a respectful distance, eyes carefully averted from the crowd. Even the Secret Service agents looked subdued. No longer part of a grand performance, but simply there to facilitate a quiet exit. The atmosphere was extraordinary. Nobody applauded, nobody jeered, but nobody turned away either. It was the kind of profound quiet that didn't need stage directions or explanation. It held its own weight, like the pause between a judge's final words and the fall of the gavel. Behind them, Thomas Morrison had resumed his perfect stillness, rifle at precisely the regulation angle, eyes fixed on that distant point that honor guardians are trained to focus on. To anyone arriving now, he might appear to have been standing exactly like this all along, untouched by drama, unbothered by spectacle. But everyone present knew better. They'd witnessed something that couldn't be captured in a quick photo or a viral video clip. As Trump passed the front ranks of tourists, he didn't acknowledge them. No nods, no waves, no final attempts at connection. Maybe he understood that such gestures wouldn't be returned. Maybe he'd finally grasped that this crowd had found something more compelling to focus on. Some of the onlookers still stood with their hands raised in impromptu salutes. Others simply maintained straight backs and solemn faces as if they'd become part of something ceremonial themselves. No one was filming anymore. The phones had been lowered or turned off entirely. Whatever this moment had become, it was too significant for casual recording. They weren't documenting. They were participating. Trump reached the waiting motorcade. His lead aide opened the car door with practiced efficiency. But Trump paused before getting in. He turned back just once, for just a moment. The entire plaza remained frozen in that quiet tribute. Faces turned not towards him, but toward the figure in simple uniform who taught them something about strength without words. He took one final look at Morrison. The veteran hadn't moved. Not for the spectacle, not for the silence, not for the cameras or the crowd or the former President of the United States. And that immobility, that absolute refusal to be anything other than what duty requires, might be what unsettled Trump most of all. He ducked into the vehicle without another word. The door closed with a soft, final thud. Moments later, the convoy began its departure, tires whispering against ancient stone as it glided back through the plaza exit and disappeared into DC traffic. But in the plaza, nothing changed. The tourists remained where they were. The silence held. Some people had tears in their eyes, though they might not be able to explain exactly why. Others were simply quiet, processing something they'd never quite experienced before. The ongoing duty of the veteran honor guardians continued its precise choreography. Pristine boots marched in perfect unison. Thomas Morrison maintained his post until his exact moment arrived. And when it did, he marched off with the same flawless precision. No acknowledgement of what transpired, no glances toward the crowd, no suggestion that anything unusual occurred. He simply executed his duty and disappeared beneath the memorial archway, leaving behind a plaza full of people who would never quite look at strength the same way again. As he vanished from view, the spectators didn't cheer or celebrate. They didn't need dramatic gestures or grand finales. They just stood. And in that standing, they'd learned something profound about the difference between demanding respect and earning it. A teenage girl near the front whispered to her companion, "He didn't even blink." An American woman murmured, "That's the first time I've ever seen him lose an argument." Her husband replied quietly, "No, that's the first time I've seen him realize he was never really in the conversation." And then, as if released from a spell, the plaza slowly began to breathe again. Phones emerged from pockets. Whispers became conversations. The tourists gradually dispersed, but they moved differently now, more thoughtfully, more quietly. Because not one person who witnessed this encounter will leave the Lincoln Memorial thinking the same way they did when they arrived. They'd seen something that can't be taught in leadership seminars or political science classes. They'd seen what happens when real discipline meets manufactured authority. They'd discovered that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to move. So, what do you think? When someone demands respect they haven't earned, should you give it to them anyway? Or should you stand your ground the way veteran Thomas Morrison did in front of the entire world? And here's maybe the bigger question. In our age of social media and instant reactions, is there still power in choosing silence over spectacle? Comment your respect below. We genuinely read every single one. And these conversations matter more than you might think. If this moment moved something in you, if it made you think about respect and discipline in a new way, hit that like button. It honestly helps more than you know. Make sure to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the incredible men and women who guard these traditions. And if you know someone who could use a reminder about what real strength looks like, someone who thinks power means making noise until people pay attention, share this video with them. Our next veteran story is already waiting on your screen. Click it now and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real authority doesn't demand recognition. It simply stands. And when it does, even the loudest voices in the world discover they have nothing left to say.